warrior, you fear to go into those mines. The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
Going to Mordor alone!
Of course you are! And I'm coming with you!
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
Boromir! To the wall! Defend the wall! Return to your post!
It'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been. It'll be the farthest away from home.
The ring is mine.
War of the Ring. Yes, it's big. It's epic. And best of all, it's this entire trilogy in a freaking game. Will you play as the Shadow and sweep over the land and conquer Middle-earth? Or will you play as the free people and hold out just long enough so Frodo can take the ring all the way to the Crack of Doom and end the game? So let's open up some pages of Tolkien's world of Middle-earth and see whether this game, War of the Ring, lives up to its hype. So here's what's going on. The Shadow player wants to move his swarms of dudes to dominate Middle-earth, conquering the free people settlements, including cities like Edoras or strongholds like Minas Tirith. If he gets 10 points worth of these, he wins the game. On the other hand, the free peoples are trying to maneuver their armies to hold off the Shadow long enough, buying Frodo enough time to get all the way to Mordor, climb the Crack of Doom, and destroy the One Ring. To do all of this, players have two main things they each want to keep track of: action dice and event cards. The action dice dictate what you can do each turn, and the event cards can be played as an action or to influence battles. So all you do on a turn is pick a dice result and use it up. These let players move special characters, the Fellowship, or of course, armies. Then there's results that let them recruit troops, or play event cards from their hand. When you play these cards, each card will let you do a special thing, such as moving troops a special way, or mustering more troops than normal. But what about the bottom half of these cards? Well, this is going to come in during battle. When the armies of good and evil clash, players can each play a card from their hand face down, and then they flip these over at the same time before the actual fighting. For the fighting, players are going to roll one die per each of their army units. Any roll of 5 or 6 is a hit, but before addressing hits, players can reroll their dice for the leaders, which are the gray minis. Then players can choose to keep fighting in another round of combat, or someone can retreat. Aside from these bloody battles, Frodo is of course going to get plenty of attention in his quest to destroy the ring. To move the Fellowship, the free people can choose to use a die action on their turn. But the tricky part is that their movement is hidden and discreet, so Sauron doesn't quite know where the Fellowship is right now on the board. To find his glorious ring, the Shadow player will roll dice every time Frodo moves. If the Shadow finds the ring, he'll pull a random hunt tile, which can reveal and damage the ring bearers, increasing their corruption. When this corruption hits 12, the ring bearers become completely corrupted and the Shadow player immediately wins. Okay, so that's just the bare bones required to get started on this nuanced game. So now, let's jump into the pros. And there's a lot of good stuff here. But you know what? Before we jump into gameplay and all that stuff, let's just take a minute to admire how this game looks. Middle-earth. Yep, this is Middle-earth, from the Grey Havens to Mordor. This includes the mountains, streams, and of course names of all the major regions. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, you'll just enjoy looking at the breadth of this board. You got the mines of Moria, the fortifications of Osgiliath, and even the far dwarven Erebor. They made use of the extra big board by having locations to put the decks of cards, extra army units, and of course all the point trackers. By the way, all of the tokens and giant cards are great quality and will last many playthroughs. Also, check out these gorgeous chunky dice with engravings, unique for each player. Awesome stuff. The miniatures you'll be putting on Middle-earth are also no slouch in detail. For the hordes of bad guy minis, there's the standout goblins riding wargs, hill trolls, and even Momakil, which means you'll be moving freaking Olifants into battle. For the free people, you'll have the mighty mounted units of the Rohan, pointy ears of the elves, and the stout dwarves. The shadow player can use these winged Nazgul miniatures as leaders, and the free people get distinct leaders for each of their factions. In addition to leaders, this game sums up to 205 miniatures by throwing in tons of the major characters. So yeah, many of the notable heroes and villains in the lore, like everyone in the Fellowship and the Witch King, are all in this game. So since War of the Ring is a really asymmetrical game, we have to begin the rest of the pros by just saying how different each side plays. Let's start with the free people, who are initially saying that yeah, that growing darkness over there, yeah, that's no big deal. Don't worry about that. To reflect this carelessness, the game incorporates a politics tracker that all the factions use. At the bottom is at war, which means that your faction can actually attack, raise troops, and move into any other nation, basically performing any assertive troop movement. No one is at war when the game starts, but Sauron and Isengard are just so battle hungry that they can just move down one space, and just like that, declaring war is super fast and makes total sense. I mean, peace was never an option for them anyways. The free people don't have this battle hungriness and are chill in the way things are, reflected by the non-belligerent state on their faction markers. See, this means that even if the political track lines up to get them to war, they won't agree to sound the drums of battle because they're still passive. So to turn active, they either have to be attacked, or someone from the main cast of characters, the Fellowship, or an appropriate companion has to come all the way over to them and tell them to wake up.
You have no power here.
Politics is so central to the free people's identity because it dictates the entire early to mid game, where you can't really mobilize units yet and have to decide which nation goes to war first. As for actually fighting these wars, the asymmetry is yet again distinct. First of all, the free people have the benefit of playing defense in their strongholds, cities, and fortifications just like in Osgiliath. See, cities and fortifications initially have the attacker's chance of hitting, where they can only hit on a 6 for the first round of combat. And then the actual strongholds of Helm's Deep and Minas Tirith really do live up to the hype in this game, which always restrict the attacker to only hit on a 6, and only allows for one round of combat unless the attacker weakens an elite unit to a normal dude. The free people also get the bonus of having all their character minis help during combat. See, these characters can break from the Fellowship from where they begin the game, and act as leaders during battles, some like Boromir even adding combat dice of their own. So the free people are tough even when outnumbered, but they can't fight forever because when any time one of the units dies, it's gone from the game forever in this box. This means that once the free people run out of reinforcements for a faction, they can't make any more units, ever. And there's only so many good able-bodied soldiers in Middle-earth, which puts a scary timer on how long the free people can defend for. Now onto the shadow player's distinctions. As suggested by the starting red globs of shadow troops all over the board, none of its 3 factions are adverse to fighting. So politics won't be a big deal here, rather management of the scores of troops is. But this whole thing is going to be different because first of all, the shadow never runs out of troops. Yep, evil doesn't care about throwing orcs and goblins into the meat grinder of war. Just keep chucking your cannon fodder at the free people. Doesn't matter if troops die as long as you win. It certainly feels like a quantity becomes quality sort of thing, with event cards allowing the shadow to constantly spawn buttloads of troops. Crazy thing about the shadow's leaders too, they're all Nazgul. And the thing about Nazgul is that they can fly anywhere on the map, giving the shadow so much freedom and letting any army of chumps become really competent in a single move. But even with all these advantages, the shadow is forced to always play offense across a huge board, and will be forced to expend so many actions just to attack once. And then there's so many options on where to attack. So while the free people are panicking on defending, the shadow will be struggling on where to send his hordes off to. He can launch a northern campaign with troops from the mountains, or an eastern campaign with the Easterlings. Of course, he can expect to funnel out of Minas Morgul into Gondor because it's so close. Now if you like the asymmetry for that entire war game, you got even more with Frodo.
Mr. Frodo?
This hunt for the ring is going to ask for even more interesting management from the players. Remember, the free people really need to accomplish the destruction of the ring before they run out of troops. To get to that, the free people can choose not to spend a die on politics or troop movement and can instead spend it to move the fellowship. But remember, this is no easy journey for Frodo, and for every time the ring bearers move, the shadow will see if he finds them with this tense dice roll. If he does, players get even more attention from drawing a random hunt pool tile, which can hurt Frodo and slow him down. But really cool thematic point here, Frodo never suffers from actual wounds. Either someone else in the fellowship can sacrifice themselves to protect him, or he has to put on the ring, which slowly corrupts him. This tricky fellowship resource allocation between the players is going to happen from before a round even starts. Before rolling dice, the shadow can place some dice in this hunt box. See, he's going to roll this many hunt dice every time the fellowship moves. But he's going to lose an action for each die he puts in. This leads to a careful balancing act from the shadow, where the shadow wants to dump in resources to slow down and hurt the fellowship, but if he puts too much, he may be missing out on actions that may be the power needed to close out the game. So while both players will be waging a grand scale war across Middle-earth, they're also sweating over hurting or moving the fellowship, which is a thematic and thoughtful process all the way through. But wait, there's another way for the free people to win that lines up with the story. Remember how the Eye of Sauron was distracted by the final battle that was going on around Minas Morgul? Well, to demonstrate this option of putting offensive pressure on the shadow, the free people can win this game by capturing 2 shadow strongholds. This is an unlikely win, but the fact that only 2 strongholds are needed can really change the game's pace up. If the shadow leaves himself too vulnerable, it's even possible for the free people to go all in on a military offense too, which keeps games fresh. With a more offensive-oriented mindset, the free people can find even more creative uses for companions, like sending Legolas on an offensive to Dol Guldur. You may have noticed that there's a different number of die per player. The shadow starts with 7 and the free people only get 4. While this seems initially unbalanced, it actually works out to the game's asymmetry. First off, the shadow loses actions to commit dice to looking for the ring, and then the free people can just choose not to move the ring at all. Plus, the free people have access to this special roll, the Will of the West, which can act as any die result when taking actions, which is super duper useful. And then there's the fact that even though they only start with 4 dice, the free people are mostly defending, and won't have to move their armies as much as the scattered shadow players.
We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
There's also a very useful mechanic to pass your turn, which the free people will have to manage very carefully, since they don't want the shadow to do whatever the heck he wants with multiple consecutive actions. The sweet touch on top is the 3 elven rings that the free people can each use once, changing any die result to whatever they want. There's actually a thematic interaction here from the players themselves, as the free people will be tempted to use this power to do any move they desire, and the shadow will agree with them, urging them to do it because once the elven ring has been used once, it goes to the shadow to use once. While there's going to be more praise of asymmetry up ahead, now is a great time to just step back and admire how different each side really is playing. They're playing their different games with different ways of gauging success. The free people don't care if they lose a bunch of fights, as long as Frodo gets really close to Mordor. The shadow is frustrated at having to dump so many actions to move across the entirety of Middle-earth, whereas the free people are concerned about politics. Okay, so now it's time to praise the next asymmetrical part of this game with the cards. So there's 2 decks of event cards, the character deck and the army deck. And these cards take an action to use. The army deck typically does military things, like, oh, would you look at that? Orcs are multiplying again, just smack a total of 6 goblins on the board. Or on the side of the free people, the Riders of Theoden can grab a Rohan leader and elite in their capital. The other deck, the character cards, can allow you to use special abilities, like the Shadow summoning Warp Tongue into play to slow down Rohan, or the free people calling up the Ents to wreak havoc on Isengard. But don't worry if you can't use the top ability anymore, because these large cards each have a second ability that you can play right before combat. Oh, and a crazy thing, There's no top ability repeats in all the decks, which makes each card so precious. Players will be holding tight onto their hand of cards, constantly darting their eyes from the bottom and top ability, because if you decide to use a card's bottom ability, you can't ever use the top ability, as players never reshuffle their discard piles into their decks. Maybe you really like the top ability, but you like the bottom battle bonus even more. But is right now the right time for the free people to go on the offensive? These cards are going to give players so many decisions that demands constant, skillful hand management. Now, because there are no repeats in any of these decks, every game will also be different. See, games of War of the Ring will look the same every time you set it up, because it's important to balance the theme that the Fellowship begin in Rivendell and say, Helm's Deep not be heavily fortified.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
But games will not feel the same, because as soon as you draw your opening hand, your brain is going to start going in a direction based off those 4 cards. Maybe you want to boldly move the Fellowship a lot early because you drew cards that can heal Frodo and Sam. Maybe the Shadow draws Horde from the East early, and can now rush an attack on the Dwarves in the Northeast. With 48 cards in total for each player, games are never going to feel quite the same, especially when you combine these cards with rolling multiple action dice. War of the Ring ends up rewarding the ability to adapt, where your master plans that stem from your cards may be delayed by a certain roll, and then you have to scramble to make the best out of your turns. Even more replayability comes with how you want to manage the Fellowship. In some cases, the Fellowship boyband will retain some of its members for a while, with maybe Strider, Merry, or Pippin acting as a guide. Actually, speaking of all these different companions, all of the companions each have their own cards, making them feel true to the actual lore. Great fighters like Legolas or Gimli add combat dice to fights, and Boromir gets a bonus while in his homeland of Gondor. All of these characteristics will encourage the free people to break the Fellowship and manage these characters across the board, adding so much to decision making. When moving, characters all move as the fastest companion they're with, letting players zoom across the map easily. Oh, and don't worry about leaving Frodo and Samwise Gamgee, the best character in the trilogy, to themselves, because there's yet another guide in this game. If there's no one leading them, Gollum will promptly come along to help the Hobbitsies out, and Gollum even has a mini. How awesome, and pretty close to the actual color of his malnourished flesh. So you may have noticed I said Strider earlier. So, well, what about Aragorn? Don't worry, he's here. Eventually, you're gonna want to transform into this kingly form, which is a stronger version to take up the helm of Gondor and lead troops into battle. Oh, and if God forbid Gandalf dies early, not to worry, he can come back as the stronger Gandalf the White.
Gandalf? I am Gandalf the White. Frodo.
Now, of course, we gotta talk about the Shadow players equivalent to these heroic companions, which start with the Nazgul being able to fly anywhere as a ready cover. Again, this is crazy bonkers freedom for the Shadow player to play around with. There's even more options for the Shadow player though. Instead of having access to the strong Gandalf and Aragorn, they instead have 3 minions to do the Dark Lord's bidding. First, you got your OG White Wizard Saruman, who can quickly bring glory to Isengard once he comes about, spawning Uruk-hai like Isengard cancer with his recruitment. Once mid to late game rolls around, you'll want to focus on the Witch King, and then eventually the Mouth of Sauron. These will really help swing the tide with their combat-centric abilities. Like, you're gonna want the Witch King in every combat, which is easy because he works like Nazgul, flying anywhere he pleases. When attacking with him, you always get a card back if you play one during the first round of combat, which is great card advantage that helps melt the free people's hopes and dreams fight after fight. So yeah, the amount of character diversity in this game is fantastic. They interact with each other so well too. The Mouth of Sauron just smells the true king and comes about if Aragorn is in play. Or how about Gandalf the White negating all the Nazgul during a fight? Plus, every time you bring out one of the stronger characters into play, like Saruman or Aragorn, you get one more action dice to use, further amplifying their effect on the game. So now that you have an idea of the awesome machinations that you can do in this game, let's talk about how the game evolves over a playthrough. So besides the game just ending, if Mr. Frodo, where'd he go? Where's Mr. Frodo? Oh, he's right there, okay. So besides the game ending, if Mr. Frodo makes it all the way to the crack of doom or dies trying, The progression is mechanically satisfying and a definite thematic fit. As more and more nations go to war mid-game, players will find themselves summoning their special characters, which each grant new abilities and an extra action die. When late game rolls around and players have even more actions, the war-stricken Middle-earth has seen so many cities and strongholds fall, and the free people are getting more and more concerned because they're running out of reinforcements to call upon. The true endgame is when Frodo makes it to the Mordor track, attempting to trek up the mountain and win the game. In this final phase of this game, you no longer roll dice to find the Fellowship, but instead always draw a hunt tile every time the ring moves, meaning that Frodo is really likely to take damage.
Come on, Mr. Frodo.
To add on to this, both players can now use cards to add tiles into the hunt pool. So the Shadow can throw in Shelob, and the Free Folk want to use Elvish tricks when the light is darkest. This increased danger from the hunt is going to make the game even more exciting right before it ends, as every move up Mount Doom is bringing Frodo one step closer to complete corruption, but also victory, and the Shadow is panicking to take the last cities needed to win. To put a seal on this list of pros is potentially the best pro of all, in that so many areas of this game just show gameplay meeting theme beautifully. They even covered a lot of the less flashy elements really well. Appropriate character abilities are always going to come up, even on the strategy cards. How about the Shadow rolling eyes on their dice, which draws away resources from managing his troops because Sauron just gets so greedy and obsessed about finding his one ring. And then combat rolls are restricted to 5 dice because there's only so much room on a battlefield for guys to attack each other. The numerous characters will give a face to the epic battles, where Gandalf the White can be leading Gondor and negating the Nazgul's effectiveness at Minas Tirith, or Pippin can journey back to the Shire to rally against a northern Sauron invasion. The dynamic of the scrappy, defending free people versus the scattered but numerous Shadow is a thrill that translates to every action each player takes, and this wargame is only part of the theme. There's a critical side story of Frodo with the ring, hiding and escaping the forces of evil while all the combat is occurring.
Come on, Frodo. Come on.
So now that we're entrenched in this game, let's talk about some things that may be hurting that magic with the cons. First things first, this is already a big game, and it's starting to show its age on how its rulebook teaches you the game. It's not organized very well, with setup being on page 16, and then when you're reading the rest of it, there's just so much text to read through that is there instead of diagrams you'd find in newer games. There's no quick start or FAQ in this game, and while there is an appendix, it isn't very well organized either. We're reminded of Gloomhaven's length of rulebook when approaching War of the Ring, but this rulebook is even harder to navigate than that. The game does come with these player aids, one for each player, and it does have a pretty nice explanation of the basic die actions. However, when you open it up, it starts to get a little overwhelming with a ton of words for the glossary, and then in the back, there's paragraphs galore for the game turn. Player aids are the place to give bullet point explanations, not these. So as it stands right now, players will have to frequently pause the game and open up this big fat rulebook. So you've read the rulebook and you're ready to play your first game. So you gotta set this up, right? Well, yeah, there's a bit of a problem here. See, when you're setting up your first game, you'll notice that all the minis in the box are initially clumped together by color. So you have to spend some time to divide them by faction. This can take a while because some of the blue minis look really similar because of their silhouettes. There are faction emblems on them, which is cool, but you're not going to be able to see that unless you bring the mini right up to your eye. Again, there are 205 plastic minis that come in this game, so the publisher had to cut costs somewhere, and that may explain why the minis feel a little soft. Just wish the minis were more distinct or at least had differently colored bases for a game where the board is so big. Mini mix-up is particularly a big problem in War of the Ring because keeping track of casualties for the free people is really important. So players want to be careful to put the blue minis and maybe plastic bags when they die. And for the plastic bags, you'll have to provide them because the game does come with an answer and it does store the cards well, but these two canyons here are kind of begging to be filled up with your own plastic bags. So you want to get at least 8 for all the plastic minis, and then some containers or more plastic bags for the rest of the tokens. Alright, cool, so you've set up the board. By the way, this took me about 13 minutes to do by myself with all the stuff organized previously, so it's probably going to take you about 5 minutes per player at least. So you're ready to start playing, and you're going to get your cool cards, and then you have this cool card that talks about heirlooming? Where's that on the board? Oh, shoot. And then what about this? This card says Karok. Where's Karok? Oh, I wish it said on the card or something. Oh, God. See, this game's cards have a lot of text that references locations that newcomers won't know about. Games like Pandemic show players with this by showing the target location on the card itself, which War of the Ring doesn't do. So your first game may be slowed down a bit as you hunt for locations on this big board, where font isn't that big to begin with. Let's talk a bit about iconography. The politic markers for this game are much too small. Like, they're smaller than the minis for being such a key part of the game. It's hard to tell if they're on the active side or not, which is a big deal for free people politics. If these could be bigger and have the passive side be more pronounced, like putting a line through it, that would help so much. Plus, on the iconography for the companion and minion cards, a quick word underneath each of the symbols would definitely help newcomers to ask what the sword and shield means for each. Now it's time for the nitpicks. So this game comes with a lot of minis and components and even cool action dice, but it only gives you 5d6 combat dice. Because big combats are fairly common in this game, you're going to want to get 5 more d6s to bring your total to 10, 5 for each player. Now, this isn't a big deal because most people probably have something like this lying around their house. The next nitpick is the listed time length. The box says 2+ hours. The website says 3+ hours. Now, 3+ hours is definitely more correct here because this game has a lot of rules and a lot of unique cards you'll have to read through. For your first couple games, plan for War of the Ring to take at least 4 to 5 hours. So now it's time to bring everything together for our recommender score, which is how we try to critically evaluate the game given the aforementioned pros and cons. And War of the Ring is gonna get a 8 out of 10 from us. There's no doubt about it. Having Middle-earth in a box is really hard to get going. It's really that whole one does not simply start playing War of the Ring. After slogging through the rulebook, you're gonna have to deal with the long setup and then a long playtime to account for. The jumbo-sized event cards are gonna prove to have a lot of words in each, and then you got all the minions and companions. I mean, also, just look at the size of this board. Absorbing all these tiny font names into your head is just part of the attention to detail that this game demands. But, Lord of the Ring fans, you will be redeemed for your efforts. But before we go any further, we should address the randomness. Now, yes, there is quite a bit that exists in this game, but it's very well managed because you got the dual purpose cards, you got a bunch of combat dice rerolls, and then each of the action die faces can be used for multiple things. War of the Ring veterans will know that over the span of multiple hours, there ends up being so many instances of reasonable randomness. Timing your cards well is going to dictate winning, not hoping to luck sack your way to a bunch of good dice rolls. Really, every decision is important because the game's asymmetry is well balanced, which is actually kind of a crazy feat considering all the cards, troop spawns, political track, and even all these action dice. This game is certainly intimidating, but don't give up if this looks like your jam because all the cons fall under the umbrella of it being hard to start. To get to the actual game faster, consider reading this example of gameplay PDF found on BoardGameGeek. Yeah, this is a lot to read still, but dedication pays off a lot in War of the Ring. There is also a 3 and 4 player variant in this game, where players will split into teams. This doesn't really change too much about the game, with each player controlling half of each side's factions. But then, since teammates can't show each other their cards, it could lead to some pretty thematic stumbling between Rohan and Gondor, and then Sauron is just yelling at Saruman to hurry up and attack faster. I haven't tried this game mode, so I can't talk too much on it, but do keep in mind that War of the Ring was designed for primarily 2 people. Expansions! Yeah, we gotta talk about expansions. So there's 2 that exist, and they all add more characters, minis, cards, and even dice to this already big game. Now I haven't played them, so I have no idea if all the new what ifs they're toting are any good. But you won't need these at all for early playthroughs, since this base game is already so replayable and balanced. War of the Ring really gives the Tolkien fan so many ingredients to make their Lord of the Rings what ifs come true right before their very eyes. What if Saruman wins the Battle of Helm's Deep like he usually does in this game? What if the Fellowship doesn't go through Moria? What if Boromir never dies and makes it to Gondor? If you're not really into Lord of the Rings, you can still have a good time with this game because the mechanics are that good. Although the rulebook doesn't hold up to the test of time, the original action die and card system from the original War of the Ring design in 2004 is marvelous to use today. And because this game has a hell of a lot going on, don't stress out too much about your first game's results. You're just not going to know the consequences of any of the event cards until you've actually played the game. Eventually, you'll figure out how to play against cards like Corsairs of Umbar, which will feel really unfair to new players. Early on, it can be the most enjoyable to just immerse yourself in another world, constantly being able to take actions even when behind, and marvel at the game being so faithful to the source material. Basically, if you love Lord of the Rings and got a dedicated buddy willing to spend hours with you on a game, go out and buy War of the Ring. Because of its ability to create so many stories and moments, War of the Ring wants to be part of your Lord of the Rings fandom. There's no hand-waving to make every mechanic feel appropriate to Lord of the Rings, which is a master accomplishment. And then the nuanced strategy cards just pull you in to keep playing again and again. You can swap off playing good and evil, feeling all the highs and lows of each side's struggles, leaving each game with new ideas for the next playthrough. So whether it be Gondor's defenses hanging on by a thread while Frodo climbs Mount Doom, or the Shadow, furious that his distant hordes have been thinned by a Rohan counterattack, the struggles of Middle-earth come to your hands. But first, you'll have to struggle to learn the game. So my personal score for War of the Ring is gonna be a 9 out of 10. I am a huge Lord of the Rings fan, if that wasn't already obvious by this review. Like, you know how they say a good movie needs multiple great scenes? Well, each of these movies has multiple amazing scenes that make me weak. Oh my gosh, I would pay just to see the battle sequence. So many great characters. Boromir, Theoden. Yeah, this is totally not a biased review, guys. See, I did have my fair share of struggling with the rules. My first game took about 10 hours over the course of multiple sessions with my aunt, a fellow Lord of the Rings fanatic. Needless to say, I got so many rules wrong, but I wasn't really mad because I got to be in Middle-earth. 3, 2, 1.
What does it say?
I think that gets you.
I'm dead?
I think it's the eye, yeah. I really felt that crushing weight of losing powerful cards with every misplay or miscalculated attack, and that feeling stuck with me days well after playing. Every combat, even the ones I think are going to be easy, are shockingly tense because every single thing matters in this game, and the dice rolling is so clean that I just want to jump up out of my seat for every single fight and watch the forces of good and evil duke it out in this super streamlined, awesome combat system. So yeah, the hype around this game was definitely true for me. It was a Middle-earth experience I've never tasted before. I'm not going to be playing this game very often though, especially since it's a long 2-player game, which I don't normally play. The way I predict it is that War of the Ring will be that game I'm perpetually excited to talk about and drool over, but I won't really be playing it more than once or twice a year. The good thing is that I've set up this board dozens of times making this review, so I'm getting really good at setup and it should be pretty easy to start a game. As always, shout out to our patrons to making videos like this possible. We got John S, Manuel G, Brian C, Clifford H, Aaron W, Max B, Bora, Jeremy M, C, Marius M, Charlie P, Quinton S, Sam S, Travis R, Alvin Y, Vomsy K, Ryan D, Jennifer L, Quacklope, Brett M, and Matt G. And we got our 2 mad lads of cardboard. We got ZL and Jeff L. Thank you guys. We got our Patreon link in the description below, and we got our catalog down below with all our recommended games, including War of the Ring. So if you want to get this awesome game, that might be the place to do it. Let me know if there's any other shorter 2-player games I should review next that aren't as long as this. And I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.